Scientists who studied the London Blitz made a discovery that nobody expected. The bombs didn't just destroy buildings, they did something to the brain itself, something that 57 consecutive nights of bombing accelerated in ways that changed what we know about fear, memory, and survival forever. Thomas Holt was 34 years old, and he was doing what every person in East London did at dusk in September 1940. He was walking fast, and he was watching the sky. Here is something the Blitz researchers documented and then quietly buried for decades. After just 14 consecutive nights of bombing, the human brain begins to rewire itself, not metaphorically, physically. The neural pathways that process threat stop waiting for evidence and start firing on anticipation alone. The underground shelters became the laboratories nobody planned. Dr. Margaret Ellery was one of the mass observation researchers who spent the Blitz nights underground with a notebook, documenting what bombing was doing to the minds of ordinary people. What she found disturbed her enough that she kept a second private journal she never submitted. Ellery's private notes described something she called threshold compression. The bomb survivors she interviewed were not traumatized in the way the medical literature predicted. Their fear threshold had not broken down, it had moved permanently. The brain had recalibrated what counted as dangerous. Thomas had been in the shelter 43 nights in a row, and he had noticed something about himself that frightened him more than the bombs. He had stopped flinching. Not because he was brave, because his brain had stopped registering the sound as a warning. Researchers gave this a clinical name after the war, acoustic habituation to mortal threat. The brain, bombarded with the same terrifying sound night after night, reclassifies it as background noise, the same way a person who lives near a railway eventually stops hearing the trains. Except the trains are bombs, and the reclassification is not relief, it is damage. By day, Thomas worked the factory floor. The lathe he operated for 10 hours had a rhythm not entirely unlike the bomb pattern, a cyclical, mechanical percussion that he found, to his own quiet horror, more calming than silence. His brain had begun to associate rhythm with safety, any rhythm. Scientists studying blast survivors found that after prolonged exposure, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for rational decision-making, begins to essentially go offline during perceived rest periods. The brain saves its resources. It learned this from the bombs. Every moment of silence might be the last one. William Crane had been referred to Dr. Ellery by his commanding officer, who reported that Crane had stopped responding to verbal orders, not because he couldn't hear them, but because the sound of a human voice had temporarily ceased to carry meaning. The part of his brain that processed language had been partially overwhelmed by 6 weeks of continuous acoustic assault. The tremor in Crane's hands was not what most people would think. It was not weakness. It was the body's preparation system stuck in the on position. Every time a bomb detonated within range, the body released adrenaline and tensed every voluntary muscle for impact. After 6 weeks of this, the muscles had forgotten how to fully release. The tremor was the body's perpetually braced for a bomb that had not yet fallen. Ellery described Crane's presentation in her private journal as hypervigilant dissociation with intact cognitive function. He could think clearly, he could reason, but the emotional processing centers of his brain had essentially locked down as a protective mechanism, leaving him intellectually present and emotionally inaccessible. He was watching the conversation from inside a sealed room. Edith Soames had been an ARP warden for 14 months. She had developed a skill she had never asked for and would never have chosen. She could estimate from the pattern of rubble and the direction of a structure's collapse exactly how many people had been inside. She was rarely wrong. Her brain had built a predictive model from data she could not stop accumulating. Here is one of the most disturbing facts documented about the Blitz. Contrary to every expectation, the people who showed the most psychological damage were not the ones whose homes were destroyed. They were the ones whose homes survived. The uncertainty of waiting night after night, not knowing if tonight was their night, produced measurably greater neurological stress than the event itself. Thomas had started doing something in his own kitchen that he could not explain to himself. He would make tea every morning and then sit with it until it went cold without drinking it. When a researcher eventually asked him why, he said he didn't know. He just needed to know it was there. The tea, researchers later understood, was a control object. His brain's desperate attempt to maintain one predictable outcome in a world where all outcomes had become random. Psychologists who studied the Blitz survivors decades later found something they called object anchoring, the unconscious adoption of a physical item as a proxy for control. The remarkable thing was how consistently survivors chose small, breakable objects, a cup, a photograph, a pen, as if the brain, having lost control of everything large, was practicing with something it could still hold. One of the strangest documented effects of prolonged bombing was the normalization of sleep in impossible conditions. Within 3 weeks, the majority of Londoners in the underground shelters slept through bomb detonations that would have woken them screaming at the start of the Blitz. The brain had performed its own triage. Sleep is more important for survival than alertness to a threat you cannot act upon, so it simply downgraded the threat. It deleted the alarm. Thomas Holt had not slept more than 90 minutes continuously in 11 days. Not because the bombs kept him awake. He slept through the bombs now like everyone else. He couldn't sleep because of the silence between them. The silence had become the threat. His brain had inverted the alarm system completely. The gaps in the terraces became a specific feature of London psychology that researchers documented but couldn't fully explain at the time. Survivors who walked past their neighbor's destroyed home every day experienced what one psychiatrist called survivor adjacency guilt. Not guilt for surviving, but a specific neurological dissonance caused by the physical evidence that the bomb had a preference. It had chosen next door, and the brain could not stop calculating why. Thomas stood in front of that gap every morning on his way to the factory. He knew he shouldn't. He knew it made the thing in his chest tighten in a way that didn't loosen until midday, but he couldn't stop. The gap was evidence of something his brain needed to keep processing, proof that random selection was operating in his immediate vicinity, that the targeting was not strategic, that it was not personal, that it was not, in any sense he could use, fair. Thomas and William had never met before the bombing started. They met in a queue for a shelter entrance on the 41st night. By the 43rd night, they had developed the specific wordless understanding that forms between people who have shared a sustained experience that language has not yet caught up to. They sat together most evenings now without talking about any of it. The brain, under sustained stress, finds companionship more restorative than explanation. Crane had developed an auditory hallucination that he had told no one about except eventually Dr. Ellery. In the gap between sounds, in the ordinary quiet of a pub conversation or a factory canteen, he heard with complete realism the incoming whistle of a bomb that was not there. His auditory cortex had been so thoroughly conditioned by the real sound that it had begun generating it from memory during silence. The brain, deprived of the stimulus it had been trained to expect, was manufacturing it. The most bizarre documented case from the Blitz hospital wards was a 41-year-old man who had been found standing in his garden in Stepney on the 48th night of bombing, completely dressed for work, briefcase in hand, at 3 in the morning. He had no memory of leaving his bed. When asked where he was going, he said with complete calmness that he was going to the office, as it was a Tuesday. It was a Thursday. His brain had retreated into the last moment it classified as safe. The brain, when overloaded, does not always break. Sometimes it rewinds. Ellery wrote in her private journal, "The brain does not distinguish between a threat that is physical and a threat that is anticipated. To the amygdala, the bomb that is coming and the bomb that has already fallen are processed identically. This means that a person living through the Blitz is experiencing two bombings for every one bomb, the real one and the one their own mind detonates in the silence afterward." By the 6th week, the air raid siren had produced an effect nobody anticipated. It had become, for a significant portion of the population, almost calming. Not because they were unafraid of what it announced, but because the uncertainty was over. The bomb was coming now. The brain could stop predicting and start responding. And responding, neurologically speaking, is significantly less damaging than perpetual anticipation. This was Edith Soames' paradox. Every night when the siren sounded, she felt, and documented in a diary she kept throughout the Blitz, a sensation she described as unwilling relief. The bombing gave her purpose in a way that the between times never could. Her brain had integrated the crisis into her identity. She was no longer a woman who survived the bombing, she was the bombing's response system. And that integration, researchers would later note, was both her resilience and her wound. What Ellery brought to the government committee in November 1940 was not what they expected. They wanted data on how to minimize panic. What she gave them was evidence that panic was not the primary problem. The primary problem was the opposite, a population that was systematically losing its capacity for appropriate fear. A population whose brains were being slowly stripped of the ability to distinguish between a genuinely safe moment and a dangerous one. The committee received her findings and classified most of them. The British government had made a policy decision that the public story of the Blitz would be one of resilience and good cheer, the Blitz spirit, and evidence that the bombing was systematically damaging the neurological function of millions of people did not fit that narrative. The science went into a filing cabinet. It stayed there for 30 years. On the 57th night of the London Blitz, Thomas Holt made a decision that surprised him more than anyone. He did not go into the shelter. He sat on the steps outside it, within sight of Edith Soames, who chose not to order him in, perhaps because she recognized the look on his face, and he watched the sky above his city absorb everything that was being thrown at it and remain. The strange thing, the thing Thomas wrote about in the account he gave a researcher years later, was that sitting on those steps under an active air raid was the first moment in 57 nights that his brain felt quiet. Not safe, quiet. The threat was real and visible and present, and his nervous system, confronted with something genuine and immediate and impossible to predict, had simply stopped trying to predict it, and had rested instead. Ellery wrote in her private journal on that same 57th night, "I have been in these shelters for 57 nights, and I have watched the transformation of ordinary people into something I do not have a clinical word for yet. They are not traumatized in the clinical sense, they are adapted. The bombing has not broken them, it has rebuilt them. Rebuilt the part of the brain that evaluates what matters, and what it has rebuilt them into is something that will take years to fully understand and decades to treat." The phrase she underlined in the private journal that night was, "They have learned to live inside the emergency." It was the closest she could get in 1940 to what neuroscience would eventually confirm, that prolonged exposure to unpredictable threat does not merely stress the brain, it restructures it. It moves the baseline. What was extraordinary becomes ordinary. What was ordinary becomes in some indefinable way unrecoverable. The bombing stopped, and that, paradoxically, measurably, documentably, was when many survivors deteriorated. The brains that had restructured themselves around a world of continuous threat were now stranded in an ordinary world with no threat to process. The restructuring did not reverse. The brain's new threat detection system kept running, kept scanning, kept finding nothing, and in that absence, it invented. Thomas Holt told a researcher in 1947 that the hardest thing about the end of the Blitz was the birds. The bird song in the morning. He said, and this is documented, that he had to sit down the first morning he heard it because his nervous system interpreted the sound as wrong. The birds meant silence, and silence by this point meant danger. What the doctors in 1941 called shell shock, and in 1943 called war neurosis, and in 1952 called combat stress, and in 1980 finally called post-traumatic stress disorder, was not, in the case of the Blitz survivors, primarily a reaction to a single traumatic event. It was the accumulated neurological cost of 57 nights of sustained, unpredictable threat. It was what happens when the brain's alarm system runs continuously at full capacity for 2 months and then is told the emergency is over. The tremor that appeared in Thomas Holt's right hand in the weeks after the bombing stopped was the tremor that William Crane had carried throughout. It arrived in Thomas not during the crisis, but after it, as if the body, no longer required to function under extreme conditions, had finally permitted itself to register what it had been carrying. The nervous system's invoice arriving after the emergency was over. The two men sat in the park and did not speak for most of an hour. This was, both of them said independently in post-war accounts, one of the most restorative experiences of the immediate post-Blitz period. Not the trees, not the spring light, the permission to be present in silence with another person who understood why the silence felt wrong, without having to explain that it felt wrong, and therefore without having to perform the pretense that it felt right. William Crane's auditory hallucinations, the phantom incoming bomb whistles, reduced in frequency over the months that followed, but they never fully disappeared. He reported them 20 years after the war in an account given to a psychiatric study in 1961. His brain had been restructured by 6 weeks of real sound into a system that generated that sound permanently as a background process. Some doors, once opened by sustained trauma, do not fully close again. What Ellery eventually presented publicly, years after the government had suppressed her wartime findings, was something that the audience in that community hall received in complete silence. She told them that the brain does not experience bombing as a series of events, it experiences it as a permanent change of environment. That the person who came out of the Blitz was neurologically not the same person who went into it, and that this was not weakness or failure, it was the most successful adaptation the human brain has ever performed under the most extreme conditions ever placed upon it in peacetime proximity. Edith Soames wrote in her own diary after that public lecture, "She said what it was, she had the words for it. I had the experience for nearly 2 years, and I did not have the words. There is something in having the words, something in the brain that settles when what happened to it finally has a name." Thomas Holt drank his tea hot for the first time in 2 years on a Thursday morning in the autumn of 1941. He noted it. He wrote it in a letter to no one, a letter he didn't send, because it seemed important that someone know that this ordinary thing had happened. That the cup of tea he had been holding without drinking for months had finally been drunk. That the control experiment had delivered its result. That something predictable had occurred and he had been present enough to receive it. Here is what the neuroscience says now about what happened to Thomas and William and Edith and the millions of others who lived through the Blitz. The hippocampus, the brain's memory formation center, physically shrinks under sustained stress. The amygdala, the threat detection center, physically enlarges. The prefrontal cortex, the rational processing center, goes partially offline. These are not metaphors. These are measurable physical changes in brain tissue, detectable on imaging decades later, that first began to be properly understood by the survivors of the London Blitz. The most chilling discovery Ellery and her colleagues made in the post-war analysis of the Blitz data was about the children. The children of the Blitz, evacuated to the countryside to protect them from the bombing, showed higher rates of psychological disturbance than the children who remained in London and experienced the bombing directly. The separated children had experienced the one thing the brain cannot adapt to, an unpredictable threat with no sensory information about it. Pure anticipatory fear, sustained indefinitely with no stimulus to habituate to. The brain exposed to the bomb could at least learn the bomb. The brain separated from the bomb could only imagine it, and imagination, it turns out, is worse. The brain does not forget the bombs. What it does, what Thomas Holt's brain did, what millions of Blitz survivor brains did, is integrate them. The bombs become part of the internal landscape, filed not as exceptional events, but as evidence of what the world is. And the people who carry that evidence go on making tea and walking to work and sitting in parks, carrying inside them a neurological map of a city that no longer exists under a sky that no longer falls. The brilliant and terrible thing about the human brain is this: it will do almost anything to keep you alive. It will delete your capacity for enjoyment if enjoyment requires a baseline of safety that no longer exists. It will delete your capacity for sleep if sleep requires relaxation that the environment makes impossible. It will delete your capacity for rational fear if rational fear requires a reliable threat-to-outcome relationship that the bombs have destroyed. It will rebuild you without asking permission into whatever the environment requires. And then the environment will change, and you will be left holding the new architecture in the old world, wondering why nothing fits. In 1948, Thomas Holt took the underground for the first time since the shelters closed. He stood on the platform and looked at the ceiling and the floor and the walls and recognized every centimeter of it. His body produced, in that ordinary commuting moment, the complete physiological state of a man waiting for a bomb, the elevated heart rate, the scanning eyes, the motionless hands. The stimulus and the response uncoupled from the reality of 1948, perfectly preserved from 1940. The body's memory is longer than the brain's reasoning. What Margaret Ellery published in 1952, 12 years after she first documented it in an underground shelter with a pencil and a notebook, was the first systematic description of what sustained aerial bombardment does to the civilian brain. It was cited in the development of protocols for treating Korean War veterans the following year. It was cited in the foundational PTSD literature of the 1970s. It was cited by researchers studying 9/11 survivors in 2002. The science that began in a London underground shelter in 1940 is still being cited. It did not stop being true when the bombing stopped. The last entry in Ellery's private journal, the one she never submitted, the one that ran parallel to the official mass observation reports throughout the Blitz, was written on the last night of the bombing campaign in May 1941. It says only this: "They are still here. Every one of them changed past any scale I have yet invented. Every one of them still here." She underlined "still here" twice, and then she closed the notebook. The city survived, the people in it survived, and the science they produced, unwillingly, unknowingly, simply by being human brains subjected to something no brain was designed to withstand, is the foundation of everything we now know about trauma, resilience, and the terrifying flexibility of the organ that keeps score of everything that happens to us, whether we give it permission or not. They had been surrounded for 57 nights. The bombs changed their brains. The brains kept going. And somewhere in East London, on an ordinary morning after the worst was over, a cup of tea went cold on a kitchen table, and then finally was drunk. If that story landed somewhere, drop a comment. Tell me which moment stayed with you, and tell me where in the world you are watching this from. See you in the next one.